I've been asked to speak on what happened in rugby between 1972 and 1986 when I was pastor there. It's a remarkable story of the goodness of God and what God did there. I went to rugby in September 1972. I had a congregation of about 50. By Christmas, it had doubled to 100. By the following Christmas, it was 200. And within a couple of years, it was 300. The church was packed. Church sat about 350, and it was packed morning and evening. Now, this was remarkable in the day we're living in now. But why this growth? What happened? Well, I always think, trying to look back in it, there were two things. First, there was prayer. The church prayed, and they really prayed. They prayed for God's blessing. They prayed for the unction of the Holy Spirit. They prayed for God to come down. And then there was the preaching. When I went to rugby, something happened to my preaching. I'd always been a good preacher, or an acceptable preacher, I suppose. But suddenly, there was a power that came into my preaching that wasn't there before. It was an amazing sort of experience. Some Sundays when I was preaching, I felt as if I was sitting in the congregation listening to myself preaching. It was quite a remarkable experience. And God came down on the preaching, and the power of the Spirit was certainly there. And there was other things that I think explain something of the growth. I always felt that I had the best bunch of elders in the country. Really were good men. They were good men. I could preach better than any of them. But some of those men had a gift for personal work, which I never had. And they were tremendous in working with people, and some with the young people, some with the old people, and the contribution to the life and witness of the church was amazing. And they knew where they were going, these men. Before I went there, they knew where they were going. They knew the church had been set up 5 years previously. People had come out of Methodism, and 3 farmers had bought an old Methodist building in the centre of town. And they knew what they wanted in that church. They wanted a centre for preaching the gospel. It had been struggling for about 5 years, and the previous pastor hadn't settled in, and there was a bit of problems when he left, and he left with a week's notice. He just went. And when I went there, the church was in a bit of a tizzle, really. But there was still a vision. There was still a vision, and they knew where they were going. When I went to rugby in 72, it was in the middle of planning for something called the Faith for Rugby, which was a campaign. Rugby existed on campaigns. Always campaigns. And there was this campaign in which every church in town was involved. The Catholics, everybody, except us. And our elders had decided before I went there, and I was totally in agreement with them, that we shouldn't be part of it. No problem with the preacher. Excellent preacher. One of the best in the country. But we could not cooperate in evangelism with people who didn't preach the gospel from one Sunday to the next. And certainly with Catholics who never preached the gospel. And so we stayed out of this. It caused problems, but we were out of it. A few years later, Mission England came to Birmingham, and with Billy Graham, and they were the same thing, you see. And we were the only church in town not taking part in Mission England. And again, we couldn't do it because of this cooperation with unbelievers, the people who didn't preach the gospel from week to week. You see, in Mission England, in Billy Graham's meetings in Villa Park, the chairman of the committee there was the Bishop of Birmingham, a man by the name of Hugh Montefiore. Now this man was a rank liberal. He didn't believe the gospel. He actually believed that John's gospel was anti-Semitic. And when Jesus criticised the Pharisees, and he was being anti-Semitic, well, we couldn't work with that. And we were outside of Mission England as well. So there were problems along those lines. But the church knew where they were going, and they stayed out of it. But the people were committed and enthusiastic. They were committed to the gospel, they were enthusiastic. Every Saturday morning we had an open-air meeting in the market, open-air market just across the road from the church. And we had about 70 or 80 people there for this open-air meeting. Every year we printed 15,000 evangelistic booklets of testimonies of people who we converted during the year. And we distributed them door to door. And so there was an ongoing evangelism. Once or twice a year we'd have an evangelistic weekend when there was gospel preachers were invited to come and preach the gospel. And this went on, but the church didn't grow because of those things. I think we had 2 converts from all the open air preaching we did, and 2 converts from all the door-to-door work we did. But the converts came by Christians bringing their unbelieving friends in, and whole families were converted. I used to call it unorganized evangelism. They would bring their friends in, because my method of ministry in Rugby was preach to the saints in the morning and sinners at night. And preach a morning ministry was a teaching ministry, by and large preaching through a book. And in the evening was always gospel. Every Sunday night was a gospel service, and people would bring their friends in, and they were converted. One of our deacons brought to the prayer meeting one week his brother. His brother was an atheist, anti-Christian, and he wanted the church to pray for his brother's conversion. And his brother wouldn't go to church. But he came to the baptismal service. Goodness knows how, but only by the grace of God, I'm sure. And he was poleaxed. He'd never heard the gospel before. And he came and he listened, and within a couple of weeks he was converted. And the impact this man had in his family was amazing. His son was a 17-year-old boy, and he was amazed at the change in his father. And so he thought he would come along to see what had happened. And he was converted. The wife was converted, and the sister was converted. The whole family was saved. And all because of the elder asking the church to pray for him. This was unorganized evangelism. There was another young boy in the church who was converted at this time. He was a bit of an out to this one. His parents had kicked him out. Long-haired boy, been on drugs and been on the occult and Ouija boards and things like that. And his family, his parents wouldn't have him in the house any longer. It never worked. And he came to church because a friend of his had been converted. And he came and he was converted. And there was this boy in the church now, in jeans and tatty old clothes, with long hair. And he told me years later, he said, I was waiting for somebody to complain about my long hair, he said. And if someone had complained, I'd have been gone. But nobody complained. And he was saved. And the change in him was amazing again. And his parents could see this change. And they had him back home. And they thought we would come along to the church and see what's happened to him. And they both were converted, the parents. And in a couple of years, father and son were both deacons in the church. This was the grace of God. This is how God was working. Unorganized evangelism. A keenness by the people to get saved, friends in, to be saved. During a period of 4 or 5 years, I don't know, we must have had 30 or so Chinese students in the church. These were young fellows, boys and girls, from Hong Kong, who came to Rugby to study for their O-levels and to get entrance into university. And one of them, well, the first couple were Christians, so they brought their friends along, and one by one these Chinese were converted. And I baptized, and only Chinese I baptized. And they were keen to reach the other Chinese people in the area. And they said to me one day, Pastor, they said, can we borrow the schoolroom one Sunday afternoon for a Chinese service to invite all our Chinese people in the Midlands along? And they were going to invite the pastor from the Chinese church in London to come and preach. And they did that. And I said, well, you can have the school, of course you can. And I said, if you want, we will pay all the church will pay all the expenses. No, he said, we will pay, but we just want to use the school. Well, they did that. Came to Saturday afternoon, and I thought I'd better pop down and see how things are going along there. And I popped in to see. I knew I wouldn't understand much Chinese, but I popped in to see. And the schoolroom was packed with Chinese men and women. Packed. They must have got every Chinese man in from miles and miles around. They went to all the takeaways and all, goodness knows. And the place was packed. That was the keenness of these people. I often thought, if we had an Saturday afternoon service with English people, we would never get half the number in. But they got every Chinese in for miles around. This was what God was doing in the work. And one thing I learned in Rugby is that you don't pick little green apples. You don't pick little green apples. Let me explain that. After a few years, the church moved manses for us, and we had a house for the first time with a garden and fruit trees. And in the garden was this apple tree, and it was loaded. It was the first year we were there with apples. Boughs were breaking with apples. And I thought, well, I'm going to save all these apples. And so I found some what you're supposed to do, and I picked the apples and I wrapped them each one in newspaper, put them in wooden trays and stacked them in the garage. I thought we'd have apples for the whole winter. Well, by Christmas they were all rotten. And I said to one of the farmers, we had lots of farmers in the church, I said, what happened to my apples? Oh, he said, you picked them too soon. He said, you picked them too soon. I said, what do you mean? He said, you don't pick apples unless they come easy. He said, if you're going to pull them off, they're not ready. If they just come away in your hands, they're ready. And I tell you what, I learned something about evangelism through that. You don't pick little green apples. When people show an interest in the gospel, doesn't mean to say they're under conviction. Doesn't mean to say the gospel, the Spirit is working them. You wait for God to do His work. And I learned in that instant to wait for God to do His work. And I was there 14 years in rugby, and I didn't lead many people to the Lord. You know the old phrase of leading a soul to the Lord. Well, I didn't do that with many of them. They were just saved. A woman came to me one day, and she said to me, Pastor, I want to be baptized. Well, her husband had been coming to church for a couple of years, I think. And I just assumed that she was a Christian and being baptized. I said to her, well, when were you saved? Oh, a couple of weeks ago, she said. I said, a couple of weeks ago? Yes, she said, a couple of weeks ago. I said, I thought you were a Christian. Oh, no, she said, I was saved a couple of weeks ago. And I didn't tell anybody, but I was saved. And she was telling me that then. I didn't know she'd been saved. But I tell you what, I prefer that happen. I prefer the Holy Spirit to lead the people to the Lord rather than me.